For this edition of Crime Chronicles, we're in New Bern, one of North Carolina's most historic cities, and its second oldest, second only to Bath, North Carolina. New Bern has always been kind of a commercial hub, if you will, even long before Europeans settled or conquered here, depending on one's point of view. The Tuscarora found this an attractive place to settle because it's where two rivers meet, the Trent and the Neuse. So naturally, it's a commercial hub with shipping, on mode of transportation at one point in time. Unlike most American cities that were settled by the English, the French, or the Spanish, New Bern was settled by the Swiss and the Germans, hence the name New Bern after the capital of Switzerland. But we're here to talk about something that happened in the early 19th century, what was called an affair of honor, or perhaps more aptly labeled an affair of stupidity. But nevertheless, it happened, and it didn't involve two stupid people. In fact, it involved two of North Carolina's leading statesmen and its most distinguished citizens. The duel between Richard Spaight and John Stanley was the most notorious affair of honor in North Carolina history. On the evening of September 5th, 1802, John Stanley mortally wounded Richard Dobbs Spaight. The confrontation marked the culmination of an intense political rivalry that had been building for more than 2 years. The word duel is derived from the Italian word duello, taken from two Latin words, duo and bellum, or two at war. A duel proper is fought in cold blood before witnesses with a certain ceremony and in accordance with a strict code of honor. The earliest known duel in the American colonies took place at Plymouth, Massachusetts on June 18, 1621. As the two duelists were commoners, they were punished, as dueling among the lower classes was not tolerated. Even as Americans tired of British rule in the 1770s, dueling increased among men of the upper classes. 2/3 as many Army and Navy officers were killed by duels in the late 18th century as were killed in battle between 1798 and the start of the Civil War in 1861. Men of the lower classes settled their differences with duels that showcased the wielding of knives and the finger gouging of eyes. The elite, however, settled their differences with pistols and accompanying seconds, who ensured that both participants fired weapons of equal destruction. Nowadays, politicians switches parties. Well, there's some typical name calling. It's on the news cycle for a while. The talking heads on CNN and that Fox News talk about it, and then it's done. But in those days, if a man switched political parties, and political parties were in flux quite a bit in the 1790s in the new country, sometimes it had very serious consequences. What Stanley did with Spaight, after Spaight switched parties, was he impugned his integrity, and he called him a name that could not go unchallenged in that day and time. Get ready, all right? The name is scoundrel. If a gentleman, and only gentlemen, were allowed to participate in affairs like this, of the upper classes, if a gentleman called another gentleman a scoundrel in the early 19th century, those were fighting words. They weren't just fighting words, they were dueling words. And that's what happened. Stanley impugned Spaight's integrity, called him a scoundrel, and Spaight, as a result, after some serious insults were exchanged, they met in a duel a few blocks from here, and Spaight was killed in that duel. Being in the public eye was not risk-free in the 18th and 19th centuries. In early America, a public insult could not go unchallenged. There were 5 labels that demanded prompt reaction. 1, coward. 2, liar. 3, rascal. 4, scoundrel. And 5, puppy. Any man who was called one of those 5 names had to respond. Failure to do so meant that a gentleman would lose his social capital and be condemned to a social death sentence. Very often, when a challenge to a duel was issued, outside parties or seconds negotiated a settlement, and the duel was avoided. It is difficult to know the percentage of American duels or challenges that resulted in a fatality, but it is likely that the percentage was around 25%. To use the legal system to repair one's honor was a sign of weakness. Dueling was an accepted norm by many, even though it was illegal. But dueling operated by a set of written rules, and woe be to any upper-class gentleman who violated the rules. Violating the rules would ruin the gentleman's reputation and his career. One distinctive aspect of some American duels was posting. It was common for American duel challenges to be posted in newspapers or in public places, even though dueling was illegal. Each party in a duel appointed a second. One job of the second was to act as an intermediary. If attempts to resolve the differences met with each party's satisfaction, the duel could be avoided. If no satisfactory arrangement could be made, the second was to arrange the rules and location for the duel, to prepare and inspect the weapons, and preside over the duel. Richard Dobbs Spaight was born in 1758 in New Bern, North Carolina. He was the grandnephew of North Carolina's royal governor Arthur Dobbs and served under General Richard Caswell during the American Revolution. After the war, he was elected to the General Assembly and later represented North Carolina in the Continental Congress and at the Constitutional Convention, where he became one of 3 North Carolinians to sign that document. From 1792 to 1795, Spaight served as North Carolina's first native-born governor, and from 1798 to 1891, he represented the state's 10th district in Congress, switching from the Federalist to the Democratic-Republican Party during his second term. When he ran for a third term in 1800, his opponent, 26-year-old Federalist John Stanley, began a series of rumors about Spaight's allegiance to the new party. In a public handbill circulated in August of that year, Stanley stated that Spaight was pursuing the crooked policy of being occasionally on both sides. Stanley won the election. 2 years after his congressional defeat, Spaight sought election to the North Carolina State Senate. On Sunday, August 8, 1802, during Spaight's campaign, John Stanley renewed his verbal assault. Stanley, a noted lawyer and orator, an orphan son of a prominent local merchant, voiced his opinions on a crowded New Bern street corner. According to one witness, Stanley stated that although Richard Dobbs Spaight was a Republican, Federalists could always command his vote, or when they were hard run, could always get Mr. Spaight's vote. Hearing that Stanley had accused him of political flip-flopping, an angry Spaight quickly drafted a letter, which he sent to Stanley via his friend, Dr. Edward Pasteur. In disputes among gentlemen of the day, using a communication intermediary was customary. The letter read, Monday morning, 9th August, 1802. Sir, I was last evening informed that you had yesterday morning, in the presence of a number of gentlemen, said that Mr. Spaight, at the passage of the Alien and Sedition laws, made it convenient to be absent, and though a Republican, the Federalists could always command his vote, or when they were hard run, could always get Mr. Spaight's vote. The above assertions made by you, which is an absolute falsehood, I consider as a direct attack on my character, and one that I will not suffer any man to make with impunity. You will therefore point out to my friend Dr. Edward Pasteur, who delivers you this, the time and place at which you will give me that satisfaction which one gentleman has a right to demand from another. I am your obedient servant, Richard D. Spaight. Stanley sent a letter back by his friend, Edward Graham, saying to Spaight in the turgid verbiage of that time period, that you are a candidate while I am a voter, that the political opinions of the candidates are a fair subject of discussion. I presume you will acknowledge my right also to converse on that subject. The men exchanged letters twice more that day, and by nightfall had agreed to let the matter rest, though Spaight desired to publish the entirety of their correspondence because, quote, what had been said may have made an improper impression on the public mind. Stanley left the next day to attend court in nearby Jones County. When he returned the following week, he read Spaight's account in the New Bern Gazette and concluded that the article portrayed him as having made humiliating concessions. Stanley wrote back to the Gazette with his own version of events, which Spaight again countered. After yet another exchange, Stanley printed a handbill on September 4th, which he circulated throughout the town. In it, he accused Spaight of having a spirit malicious, low, and unmanly. The insults were escalating. Spaight again answered, this time with his own handbill, stating that Mr. Stanley is both a liar and scoundrel. I shall always hold myself in readiness to give him satisfaction, to assure him that if he asks for it once, he shall not be under the necessity of doing it a second time. After the publication of these words, Stanley sent a letter to Spaight, requesting that they meet to duel as soon as may be convenient, as if choosing a time to die or kill someone else were ever convenient. Duels often resulted from the accusation of lying, an implication that another man was dishonest and therefore dishonorable. Though the Stanley-Spaight duel came out of Stanley's initial criticism of Spaight's party allegiance, the central issue in the dispute was not his actual voting record, but that Stanley accused Spaight of inconsistency and dishonesty. If a man of honor were to ignore accusations of lying, he would, in effect, legitimize them. A man who was publicly dishonored would lose his friends, business connections, and elected office. To be without honor was to be equated with the lowest possible station in life, slavery and cowardice. Death was the preferable alternative. At 5:30 in the afternoon of September 5th, 1802, Stanley, Spaight, and their seconds, Graham and Pasteur, met on the outskirts of Newbern in front of approximately 300 spectators.
Well, after all the back and forth insults between Stanley and Spaight, the situation could not be resolved. In fact, it just escalated and got even worse, to the point where a duel was the only honorable way to settle their differences. So it took place right around here. Now, to my left is the Masonic Lodge. It was a Masonic Lodge in 1802, and it's a Masonic Lodge in Newbern today. A lot of early American patriots and prominent statesmen were Masons. Don't know if Stanley and Spaight were or not. But in any case, this is where they met. Now it's a residential area in the middle of Newbern, the middle of town. At the time, it was on the outskirts of town, and again, near the Masonic Lodge, and probably not by accident. Well, the marker that commemorates the duel is over my shoulder right here. You can see it barely behind this tree. And so in this approximate area is where the two men lined up with their seconds. This happened on a Saturday afternoon about 5:30. And word of this duel had gotten around town. Hundreds of people assembled to watch this duel. After all, there was no TV, no movies, no internet, no smartphones in those days. So this was a source of entertainment of some sort. Well, the two men lined up. Their seconds inspected the weapons. One of the seconds, as was his duty, yelled, "Present," at which time both men fired. Both men missed. Neither were good marksmen. On the second try, neither man was satisfied. So on the second try, they fired again. They missed again. Now the crowd's mood is starting to turn. They're starting to see this not so much as an exhibition or a show, but as something horrible they don't want to happen. But the two men aren't satisfied. Their pride is still very well intact. And so they take a third shot. The third shot did not hit either man, but it did strike Stanley's coat button. But it deflected on. Fourth shot was taken. The fourth shot was fatal. Spaight was shot in the side, Stanley was unhit, and Spaight died the next day. We're here at the Newbern Historical Society to talk about the Stanley-Spaight duel. And with me is Jim Hodges. Jim, can you tell us what you do? And
Yeah, good morning, Mark, and thank you for coming. I'm the volunteer curator for the Newbern Historical Society, and have been for 13 years. And before that, I had been a practicing dentist for 38 years.
Okay.
So this is a nice next chapter.
Right.
But the Historical Society has been around for 100 years. We celebrated our 100th anniversary in 2023, and we have a large membership and a very active organization with good leadership. But we've got an amazing collection of artifacts that are specific for Newbern and Craven County. And what I want to share with you today is one of these examples of our artifacts.
I want to thank Jim for meeting with me here, because we're here to talk about, as you know, this episode is about the Stanley-Spaight duel that happened here in Newbern. And in some email correspondences with Jim and the New Bern Historical Society, came across something that we think is pretty interesting, to say the least. So tell us what we got. I'm afraid to touch this thing because it looks like, if you have real tender or brittle or dead bark on a tree, what happens when you touch it. So that's why I'm not going to touch it. But go ahead and tell us what we got here.
This is old. This dates back to the 1790s, early 1800s. But this is a leather-bound ledger. And as you can see, it's not in the best of shape, but if you were 200 years old, you wouldn't be in very good shape either. So I'm going to open this up because, and the ledger belonged to a man by the name of John Oliver, and he was a merchant in downtown New Bern, and he had a variety of products that he sold, and I think he loaned money, just a little bit of everything to make a living. But this is open to a page. Richard Dobbs Spaight had an account with John Oliver, and evidently it was big news of the town. And I've read a little bit about the duel and all the events that led up to the duel, and the sparring, the verbal sparring that Richard Dobbs Spaight and John Stanley had. And I mean, it was all regarding honor. Just don't insult me, because
An affair of honor.
Yep.
Which I call an affair of stupidity, but never mind.
Well,
or self-murder.
And something I thought was interesting, that John Stanley, two of his siblings were killed in duels. Thomas and Richard, I think, Edward. But anyhow, this is Richard Dobbs Spaight account, and this is an entry that John Oliver made. And the amazing thing, he made this entry in his ledger. I mean, obviously before the time of computers and everything, this is how they conducted business. And he went to the duel, and as far as I'm aware, this is the only eyewitness account to the Stanley Spaight duel known to exist. I've never heard of anything else. But he's noted here, killed in a duel with Mr. John Stanley at the fourth fire. I was present and saw him fall. Signed, John Oliver. So that pretty much closed the account.
Just like that.
Yep.
Spaight's influential friends brought a murder charge against John Stanley. Stanley avoided prosecution by appealing to Governor Benjamin Williams, referencing the dignified sense of honor which adorned his character, and asking whether it was possible or would have been proper for him to acquiesce with humility, to have bowed himself to the epithets of liar and scoundrel. As a man of honor himself, the governor understood Stanley's predicament and pardoned him. However, on November 5th, 1802, the North Carolina General Assembly passed an act to prevent the vile practice of dueling within this state. The death of a high-profile politician pushed many to consider the drawbacks of dueling, and the new law prohibited duel participants from holding public office and required them to pay a heavy fine. It also stated that the survivor of a deadly duel and his second would be executed, and compounded the punishment by not allowing the condemned to have the counsel of a minister before their execution. But laws alone cannot change hearts and minds. Many prominent North Carolinians simply took their duels to Virginia or South Carolina in following years. Ultimately, since those politicians who passed anti-dueling laws were from the social class that most often engaged in dueling, such legislation was rarely enforced. John Stanley lived until 1833, though he spent the final 7 years of his life in debt and paralyzed from a massive stroke. He also lived to see two of his brothers, Richard and Thomas Stanley, die in duels. The honor culture that encouraged such displays of violence continued to gain importance among white Southerners. There were other famous duels in 18th and 19th century America involving some of the leading politicians and statesmen of the day. In 1777, in Savannah, Georgia, Button Gwinnett, the governor of Georgia, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the namesake of one of Georgia's largest counties, was killed in a duel with another popular Georgian, General Lakeland McIntosh. The cause, differences over military strategy during the Revolutionary War, and subsequent military endeavors. McIntosh was acquitted of murder and left the state of Georgia. In 1801, also in Georgia, disputes over land transactions led to a deadly duel between Georgians William Crawford and Peter Van Allen. Van Allen was killed. The victorious Crawford went on to serve as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of War. Crawford is the namesake for several counties and cities in Georgia and other states. The most famous duel in American history came in Weehawken, New Jersey on July 11, 1804, when Vice President Aaron Burr killed former Treasury Secretary and Founding Father Alexander Hamilton. That duel is the subject of another edition of Crime Chronicles with Mark Jones. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, was involved in numerous duels throughout his life, though only one resulted in his killing an opponent. His most famous duel came in Kentucky in 1803 against Charles Dickinson, where he killed Dickinson after being wounded himself. The cause? Dickinson publicly insulted Jackson's wife when it was discovered that Rachel Jackson had not legally divorced her first husband before marrying Andrew. In 1820, Navy Commodore Stephen Decatur, for whom several U.S. counties and cities are named, was killed in a duel in Washington, D.C. by a fellow naval officer named James Bern. The cause? Decatur's criticism of Barron's naval service. Bern was eventually reinstated in the Navy. In 1838, Maine Congressman Jonathan Silly became embroiled in a dispute with Kentucky Congressman William Graves. After Silly accused Graves of financial misdeeds on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, the two fought a duel with rifles in Bladensburg, Maryland, a common dueling ground for feuding Washington politicians. Silly was killed. Graves was not even prosecuted. The Silly-Graves duel marked a turning point, at least with Northerners, who believed that dueling was now a barbaric anachronism and a symbol of a backward Southern culture. What about women duelists? While most duels involved men, there were a few between women. With men, the issue was usually honor, either their own or the woman they loved. With women, it was fighting over the affections of a man. In 1817, a Georgia newspaper reported on a duel that occurred at the Georgia-South Carolina line, in which two women dueled over a man's affections, and one was killed. The man married the arbiter who had arranged the duel. A Virginia minister named Samuel Lowe was among those who led the charge against dueling, calling it suicide of the highest grade and in the first degree. Dueling fell out of favor in the North, but it died much slower in the South. Zachary Taylor, a Southerner who won the 1848 presidential election, included an anti-dueling stance in his campaign platform. No one could dare question the bravado or machismo of Old Rough and Ready, a wealthy Southern slave-owning warrior. If a man like Taylor opposed dueling, other wealthy Southern planters should do likewise.
As was the case in most American states at the time, the North Carolina legislature tightened up its laws on dueling. These measures had little effect. What was needed was a change in attitude. They had little effect because the legislators, the judges, the prosecutors, all were men of honor, gentlemen. And so they therefore understood this stupid, if you will, code of honor that existed. So prosecutions were very rare. On top of that, if a person was involved in a duel and was victorious or survived, and if they were prosecuted, they can always say, hey, the other guy started it. It was just self-defense. I had no choice. Kind of a lame argument nowadays, but it would wash back then. What was needed was a change in attitude, and that would come not from legislators or judges or prosecutors. It would come from the pulpits of Christian churches. Christian ministers argued that dueling was a form of self-murder or suicide, and therefore was a deadly sin. But it took a long time for that attitude to take effect. In fact, dueling disappeared much quicker in the North than it did in the Southern United States, but it took the Civil War of the 1860s to finally abolish dueling. People in the South had had enough bloodshed, enough young men and middle-aged men killed in duels, to the point where it became no more. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now, and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community, and thanks for tuning in.